All right, everybody, welcome to Off Camera Flash 101. My name is Mark Billingsley, and I'm at Mark Billingsley Photography. I am exclusively a wedding photographer in Nashville, Tennessee, and you can tell from the wonderful accent that I get it honest. If you'd like to check out my work, feel free to do so. It is at markbillingsley.com, and you can follow me on Instagram. I'm fairly active there at Mark Billingsley. This tutorial is basically meant just to start at zero and get you up to speed so that you have a basic understanding of off-camera flash. Some of the terms that we go over are extremely basic, but we want to make sure that everybody that's watching this has a good understanding of the kind of the baseline so that uh, when you do actually start experimenting and discussing off-camera flash and concepts with everyone else, you do have a good working knowledge and there's no real holes. I'm trying to answer all the questions that everyone's kind of afraid to ask. So let's get started with the simple stuff. The inverse square law. This is math, and every photographer loves math. This is what the inverse square law looks like in formula, and this is what the inverse square law states. It is in physics, an inverse square law is any physical law stating that a specified physical quantity or intensity is inversely proportional to the square of the distance from the source of that physical quantity. Seems easy, doesn't it? In reality, obviously, no one loves math, and we don't really even need to understand what this is saying as long as we can understand the concept. And it doesn't just apply to light, but for photographers, that's all we really care about. It applies to sound or anything that starts at one point and spreads out in a fairly even manner. So let's take a look at this chart real quick. So this graph does a good job of visually explaining the common confusion with the inverse square rule. The inverse square rule basically is meant to describe how the distance from the light to the subject changes the intensity of the light. You would think if you've got a light 1 foot away from a subject and you move that light back to 2 feet away from the subject, because you've doubled the distance, you'd cut it in half. In reality, you've cut it to 1/4 the power. And this graph does a really good job of showing that. If you look at the red square, that's 1 foot away from the source, the black dot. Once you move and double that distance to the orange squares, you'll see that you have 4 times the amount of area that light has to hit. When you double the distance from the orange square to the source, that then takes you to the green area, and instead of having half the light, you've got another 4 times the area. So every time you double the distance from the subject, you increase the area that light hits by 4 times, which cuts your light down by 1/4. That's basically what the inverse square law means. So as you back a light up or move a light forward, you're either increasing by 4 times or decreasing by 4 times every time you double that distance or cut the distance in half. So that's basically what the inverse square law does for you. Let's talk about depth of light. Now, depth of light is related to the inverse square law as well, but a lot of us think of depth of field, and we're very good about understanding that, and we understand that the closer we get to the subject, as long as we have the same aperture and the same focal length, the closer we get to the subject, the less depth of field. Light does the exact same thing, and it's very important to understand the depth of light because that's how you determine the dramatic effect and the look of the light versus the highlights versus the shadow. This is a really old diagram that I found in a book that was published online, and it shows a pretty good description of the light source 5 feet away from the young lady there sitting in the chair. Then when you add a guy who is 7 feet away, because the fall off of that light is more intense the closer you get, the distance between her and the light is 5 feet. The distance between him and the light is 7 feet. But there is a one-stop fall off between her and him because how close that light is to the subjects. Now, this is very applicable when you're photographing groups and you've got a light, say, 5 feet away, and you've got one person standing behind another person, or even a couple, like this diagram. One way to overcome that is to back the light up even further so that there is less depth of field, or a greater depth of light the further away that light source is. The fall off isn't as rapid the further you get. the relative relationship between the guy and the girl here, they're still the same 2 feet apart. But now she is only she's 10 feet away from the flash. He's 12 feet away from the flash, which has a different relationship factor than they were before. They're not in the really intense part of that light. So the fall off is less the further away you get. So now the fall off between her and him in that same light, the same power, is only half of a stop. Um, that's very important to know when shooting groups. A lot of times, what I'll do when I'm shooting a wedding and there's 4 or 5 people deep, I'll back my light up 25 feet, use a big umbrella, spread it out, and the distance between that first person and the fourth row is maybe a third of a stop of light fall off, which is very acceptable. Here's another good diagram to show that it's not just the light source itself; it's how far the light has traveled. So if you look here, we've got a reflective umbrella. So it takes 3 feet to get from the light to the umbrella, then another 7 feet to the lady. That's 10 feet from light to subject. So there's another way. If you don't have a lot of room to kind of back up that light, you can use a reflective source like that to diminish the fall off. It's also very important to understand that relationship when you're dealing with backgrounds. If you've got a light very close to the subject and very close to the background, the closer that light is to the subject and background, the more intense the fall off is going to be between that person and the background. So in this instance, you've got the light 5 feet from the lady. She's 2 feet from the background, so the light is 7 feet from the background. That's going to mean that you're going to lose one stop of light on that background. So she might be at one f-stop, and the background would be an f-stop lower than that. Now, if you were to move her further away from the background and closer to the light, now she is 2 feet from the light, and the background is 4 feet from the light. That's going to mean that she has 2 stops of light brighter than the background. So if you're wanting to darken a white background to gray, this is the way you would do it. Move her closer to the light and further away from the background, and then the relationship between those two will be greater, meaning more fall off of light. This is a really good way to get a very, very dark background. You can turn a white background into black by doing this. You move her very close. In this relationship, she is 2 feet from the light. I'm sorry, 4 feet from the umbrella, which is again another 2 feet from the flash. That's a total of 6 feet. And then she is 6 feet from the background. So this is basically the same look as the previous slide because she is now 2 stops brighter than the background. So let's take a look about how this actually looks on a mannequin. If you look here to the right, you're going to see that we have on the top figure here a distant softbox. The softbox is far away, let's say 10 to 12 feet away, and because the distance between the subject and the background is relatively small in relationship to the distance between the subject and the light, in this instance you're going to have a fairly well lit and evenly lit subject and background. On the bottom instance here, you've got a softbox that's very close to the subject. Now, because there's a strong fall off, the closer you are to that light, you're obvious, and because the intensity of that light is going to increase as you bring it closer to the subject, you are going to have to re-expose for the flash because the light will be brighter because the inverse square law says the closer we get to the light source, the more light's going to fall on that person's face. So obviously you're going to re-expose, but you're going to see that the depth of light is much more intense in that bottom diagram. Because she's much closer, let's say 2 or 3 feet in this instance, the fall off happens much faster, and you can even see that the background is obviously much darker. That's depth of light, and it's very important to understand. Once you start playing around with off-camera flash, you really start to get a feel for it. And no one's really doing math. I mean, you just start to instinctively understand it. If you look at the top here, this gives a good explanation. In the top instance, it's almost an equal distance. The relationship between the subject and the background is very close together in relationship to how far that light source is. As you push that light closer, then the difference between the subject and the background becomes much more important because that light fall off happens much greater the closer you are to the light. So depth of light again is very important to understand. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the different types of off-camera flash. Um, in a lot of the big studios, professional studios, you'll see photographers that are using the pack and head strobe. This is basically a two-part unit where you have a power pack that is plugged into a wall. You can plug it into a battery. It could be powered. And then you'll have light units, which are going to then be plugged into that pack. The advantage to this type of unit is you generally have more power to offer. The watt seconds and most strobes, studio strobes, are measured in watt seconds. An Einstein, for example, is 640 watt seconds. This power pack might be 2400 watts. Actually, it's 1200 watt seconds. You can see the Acute 2 is 1200 watt seconds there. So if you were to plug both of these flashes into this 1200 watt second head, pack, you would have two 600 watt second flashes. Um, Now, the good thing about this is if the photographer's standing right next to the power pack, he can reach over and turn the power up and down as needed to, instead of having to walk to each individual light to control that power. The other thing is if there's a failure in the flash head, if there's a failure in the pack, then you replace half of the thing, not the entire thing. Um, but you see a lot of these are being used by professional studios, commercial shoots, because they do allow for much more power, and obviously one area to control all the power for all the different lights. In recent years, we've seen more and more of the monoblocks. This is where the power for the light and the actual flash head itself are contained in one unit. This is the Paul C. Buff Einstein. It's the monoblocks that I actually own and use, and this is a nice kind of solution if you want to be more portable. If you don't need quite as much power, because generally monoblocks aren't going to have the same amount of power. They're generally less expensive. The disadvantages, obviously, is if you don't have some sort of an on-camera controller, which Einstein does make one where you can control the power to each light from your camera. But if you don't have that, you have to go to each individual light and turn the power up and down as needed, which can be a pain, and one of the reasons that the pack and head combination is always going to be very popular. But you're seeing more and more of these monoblocks come out. We've recently seen the Profoto B1, which is a monoblock with a battery actually attached to it, which is kind of nice. In this monoblock here, the Einsteins and most monoblocks, they do offer power packs, battery packs that you can take with you. Most people will attach those to their stands and then use that power pack to go on location and fire the flash. But of course, you can obviously plug them in right to the walls. Each of these units does have its own power source and its own control source, and that's a monoblock. This is the power, the B1 that I was just talking about. This is a monoblock that is also battery powered. Now, I believe I don't own the B1, and I've only shot with it once, and I didn't get a chance to notice. But I don't actually even think that you can plug these in. I think you have to recharge the batteries. So if the battery goes out, you can't necessarily just plug it into the wall. Um, but for what you use these for, and the reason you buy these is to have power on the go. So this is a great solution. And in fact, the B1 was the first studio strobe to actually offer TTL through the lens metering, which we'll get into later. But it is a really nice feature. It does make it more expensive. This light I think retails for around $2,000. The Einstein, which we just looked at, I think you can buy for 500 bucks, and it doesn't have TTL, but they both have very good quality of light. And there are many other brands. I'm just talking about the some of the ones that are common. The equipment needed for off-camera flash. First of all, you need a flash unit, whether you're going to use a monoblock, a pack and head, or a speed light, something like that. And then you need something to trigger it. For many years before we started kind of improving our triggering systems, you would use a PC sync cord. A cord actually came from the camera to the flash unit or to the power head, and every time you released your shutter, it would send a signal through that cord and tell the pack to fire. These days, most people are using radio triggers, and it's simply either comes out of the camera connected to the PC sync, or out of the hot shoe, which we'll talk about those two differences later. And that then, when you press the shutter, sends a radio signal to the flash telling it to fire. You're gonna need a stand of some sort. There's all kinds of different stands you can buy. They range anywhere from $20 up to hundreds of dollars, maybe even thousands of dollars, depending on the type of stand. I generally recommend that you buy a stand commensurate with the type of shooting you do. As a event wedding shooter, I like stands that are small, portable, and mobile. I use them mainly for speed lights. I do sometimes take my studio strobes on location with me. But the stand that you buy generally you'll want to have that reflect the type of modifier and light that you'll be putting on top of it. Meaning you don't want to have a relatively lightweight stand and put an expensive, heavy studio monoblock flash on top of it. You need mounting hardware, a cold shoe mount, something for the speed light in this instance. Let's talk speed light because that's what a lot of us are going to be using, especially to begin with. Uh, um, you want something that will take that stand and allow you to then fix the light to that stand. And for most of us, we use a cold shoe mount. On top of that, the umbrella mount is also common for speedlight modifiers. The mounting hardware typically will come with an umbrella mount, and a lot of the different modifiers that you use for speedlights are use that same umbrella type mounting hardware. And then tilt mechanism again is often incorporated into the mounting hardware and the umbrella mount. External battery packs. A lot of people who are going to be shooting a lot of flash will have an external battery pack. The four AA batteries that you use in your typical speed light will probably power that light for 100 to 150 full power flashes. Most people aren't shooting full power flashes, but if you're shooting, let's say, quarter power, that might be 300 or 400 flashes, and then you'll start to lose power. That slows down your recycle rate, which we'll talk about later. So there's a lot of people who will actually either buy external battery packs that can then plug into that flash and extend the life of the batteries as well as the recycle rate. It will use 4 to 12 batteries instead of the typical 4 in the flash unit, the speed light. And by using more batteries, it gives you more power quicker, which allows that flash to recycle faster, meaning you don't have to wait as long between flashes. It allows you to work faster, allows you to kind of react to the moment without having to wait for that flash to recycle. This is a good example of the Photix speed mount, umbrella mount that I use. One of the ones that I use. You can see on the very top there, that's the cold shoe mount. Cold shoe just means it doesn't relay any signal. It's purely mechanical, purely there to physically hold the speed light to the stand. The little ring below that is a tightening ring that allows me to kind of maneuver left or right as I see fit, the way the flash head actually faces. Below that, you're going to see that brass plate there that is actually allows me to remove that cold shoe mount and add a different type of mount if I choose to. Right below that, you're going to see where the rod for the umbrella mounting system would slide through. Then below that, you'll see where you would tighten the tilting mechanism. And then below that is actually a speed release so that you can pull it off the top of the stand quickly and easily if you want to pull this entire mechanism off your stand. Okay. Let's talk about speed lights or speed lights, and you'll notice they're spelled differently there, and a lot of people get confused because they don't know how to spell it. In reality, the term speed lights, as written on the top there, LITES, is the brand that Canon uses. That's what they call their units, the flash units, the flash guns you might hear them referred to as. And then speed lights spelled what we would consider correctly is what Nikon uses to refer to their speed lights. Guide numbers. Guide numbers are how we measure the power output of a flash, speedlight flash. It's different for strobes. Strobes are generally measured in the amount of power that the full power can produce, and that's usually done in watt seconds. So you might hear someone say, "Oh, an Alien AB400, Alien B400 has 400 watt seconds worth of power. AB 800s have 800 watt seconds worth of power. The Einstein has 640 seconds worth of power." And that kind of gives you an idea of how much power it actually can produce. A good rule of thumb is you're generally around that 600 watt seconds to overcome noonday sun. So an AB 400 won't have as much power, and you can't really turn daylight into dark. But if you get up to that AB 800, then you probably can. So the guide numbers is how we talk about speed lights. Now it would be great if they would use watt seconds for speed lights, but they typically don't. The average speed light has somewhere between 40 to 60 watt seconds worth of power if you were to kind of use those same types of numbers to describe it. Okay, so the guide number is actually the distance that the light is from the subject to give a proper exposure times the f-stop number equals the guide number. So, for example, if you're 40 feet away from the subject at f4 and you get a good exposure, then 4 times 40 would give that speed light a guide number of 120. If you're 40 feet away and you get the proper exposure f 1.4, then obviously that's not as powerful of a speed light because you need a more open aperture to get a proper exposure. That would give that same speed light the guide number of 56. You're going to find that most speed lights today, most modern speed lights, the SB900s, the 580EXs, the 600s, the Yangyo 568s, they all are kind of in that 55 to 63 guide number rating. The odd thing is that most guide numbers, when manufacturers are listing their guide numbers, they don't list the f-stop number. So you don't really know for sure exactly if you're comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges or apples to oranges. The general idea is when they do list a guide number of 58, for example, kind of assume that they're probably using the lowest f-stop possible because every manufacturer wants to have the biggest rating possible. But it is very confusing, and it is very difficult to understand those guide numbers because they're not always giving you all the information. A 600 EX at f1.4 has a guide number of 60, so that gives you something to kind of compare it to. Recycle rate. This is very important in flash photography. The recycle rate, refresh rate is another way to say it, is how fast under a full charge battery between full power pops. So if I'm shooting full power 1/1, and that's kind of how speed lights are measured. You'll have 1/1 is full power, 1/2 is half power, 1/4 is fourth power, 1/8 is an eighth power, 1/16 power, 1/32 power, 1/64 power, 1/28 power. And then typically you'll be able to set that flash to either go in half increments or third stop increments. So you can have 1/2 plus a third, 1/2 plus 2/3, and then one full stop. But if you're one full stop, how fast under full charge battery between full power pops is your refresh rate, your recycle rate? It's important for event photographers, especially if you're a wedding photographer and the bride's coming down the aisle and it's a dark church and your flash is way back away because you want an even coverage and you want no real light fall off because that one speed light has to illuminate her the same, whether it's 90 feet away or 80 feet away or 60 feet away. Or you just have to put it far away because you don't want the speed light right there in the middle of the church. That recycle rate's important because that flash may have to work very hard. You might be at half power. You might be at full power even. And most flashes these days, they don't have super fast recycle rates if you're just using internal batteries. This is potentially annoying for studio work, but not quite as important because with studio work, you're not capturing things as they happen. You have control of what's happening. To give an example, the SB900 takes over 3.5 seconds from full power to recycle. So if you set a flash on an SB900 and it's full power and you take a picture, you've got to wait 3.5 seconds before that flash can take another image. Okay? If you use an external battery pack, you might get that down to 1 second to wait in between. The TT860 lithium-ion battery-powered flashes that I use, my own personal speed lights, without an external battery pack, because they use rechargeable batteries, lithium-ion batteries, much like our cameras, they will recycle from a full power pop in 1.3 seconds, which is really fast. from internal batteries only, and that's one of the main reasons that I use those flashes, those speed lights. Flash zoom. Flash zoom is basically think of it as if you've ever had a flashlight that you can kind of zoom it in the coverage area. That's the same thing with flash zoom. Auto mode is what most people have their flash zooms set to. And not every flash unit is going to have a zoom. Not every flash unit is going to have auto zoom. But in auto mode, the flash zoom will actually match its flash to the lens coverage. And what this means is if you're shooting at 50 millimeters, there's no reason for that flash to be illuminating a field of view that would be covered by a wide angle lens at 24 millimeters. So that flash itself will zoom itself in to 50 millimeters. Most flashes go from 105 millimeters to 24 millimeters. This can also be used creatively. You can zoom in your flash to make it kind of work almost like a snoot or a grid. If you're at let's say 24 millimeters and you're taking an environmental portrait and your bride is kind of up against a wall and you want that flash just to illuminate her and you want it to kind of create a vignette in camera, then you can zoom that flash head in using a speedlight zoom and manually zoom that flash to creatively create that vignette. Again, um, zooming in and out does lose light because much like the inverse square law, as you concentrate that light in a smaller area, that smaller area becomes more brightly illuminated. So if you're at 105 millimeters, which is the maximum zoom that most flash heads will do, that's your baseline. That's a full exposure. Once you uh, open up that area and expand that area to a 50 millimeter zoom range, you've lost a little bit over a stop in exposure. And then as you move to a 24 millimeter zoom, which is as wide as that thing will zoom, that same flash exposure will now have lost about a stop and a half in exposure. We're going to talk a little bit about the diffusion panel that you can pull out of the top of most speedlights. If you pull that out and add that over a 24 millimeter zoom on your flash head, instead of having 24 millimeters worth of coverage, you'll now have about 14 millimeters worth of coverage. But then instead of having 1.5 loss of light, you'll cut your light down by about 3 stops. So that's good information to know. Some triggers, and we'll talk a little bit more about triggers here in a little bit. Some triggers can manually control the flash zoom. I use the Yangyo YN622 triggers transceivers with the master controller. The Phottix Odins will do it as well. That's the other system that I own. And on both of those systems, I can manually control the zoom of my flash units by groups. So a group can be zoomed in at 105, while the B and C could be zoomed out to 24 if I choose. And that really gives you a lot of creativity that you can use those zooms in a real creative way. And it's probably the one thing that a lot of people don't really use very often, but could be used much, much more. Here's a visual example of what we were just talking about. If you look at the top left, that's 24 millimeter zoom. That's wide spread out. That's the biggest area that the flash will cover without using a diffusion panel or diffusion material. And you can see how that doesn't have a really bright hot spot on the nose of the subject. Then as you move to the right and then start over again on the bottom left and keep moving to the right, you'll end up at the 105 millimeter zoom. That's as zoomed in as you can get it. You can see in that image that there's a vignette created in camera by the flash because that flash is now concentrated really on the mouth and nose of the subject. So that gives you an idea of how you can kind of zoom that flash to creatively spotlight what you want, to overexpose, underexpose different areas, or however creatively you want to use that zoom head. Flash duration. Flash duration is basically talking about the amount of time that the light from the flash exists. When you set off that flash, and we'll talk about speed lights almost exclusively from this point forward, unless I mention otherwise. When you trigger the flash, most speed lights at full power will pop a flash that exists for about a 250th to 1/300th of a second. Okay, speed lights tend to have short flash durations. Okay, the light doesn't exist very long. That's an advantage. That's nice. You're able to freeze motion in an image because that flash comes on and goes away super fast. So even if you're using a slow shutter speed, that flash comes and goes in such a bright burst of energy, burst of light, that it will freeze the motion. So the lower the power of the flash, the shorter the duration for most speed lights. In fact, I think for all of them. Um, for example, I think at one full power, the Yongyo 560 has about a 1/300th of a second. If you go down to 1/16th of a power, that flash duration only lasts for 1/8000th of a second. So speedlights do tend to have an advantage over most strobes. Part of that is because obviously they're less powerful. Um, if you're buying a strobe that has a really short flash duration, you're paying a lot of money generally, especially if it recycles very fast at that low flash duration. The kind of the one strobe that really has a fast flash duration that you're not paying a super premium for is the Einstein, and a lot of sports shooters will actually buy that flash simply because it does have a very short flash duration at a very good price point. Let's talk about sync speed. Sync speed is very important, and it's usually specific to your camera model. Every camera has a sync speed at which point the you can't shoot flash photography higher than that shutter speed. Okay, it's basically the fastest shutter speed at which your sensor is 100% exposed. You can't exceed the sync speed of a camera if you have a flash that will do high speed sync. And we can talk a little bit about that by looking at a video here of an actual shutter opening and closing. This is 200 sync speed. This is generally where most Canon cameras, or a lot of the nicer Canon cameras, have their sync speed set. And I'm actually using this controller here to open this up. You can see, here's how the shutter works. The first curtain opens, and this is when the flash will hit right there at the point that the sensor is fully exposed at 1/200th of a second. That flash will fire and go away, and then the second curtain will follow right behind. Okay? As we move on and look at a thousandth of a second shutter speed, you'll see that that first curtain is going to open right here, and that second curtain follows right behind it. So as the curtain travels, there's only a sliver of that sensor that exposes at any one time. So if you were to shoot a flash right there, pop, and it goes away, the only part of your image that's going to be illuminated is that one little sliver. So high speed sync on a flash makes the flash go pop, 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 pop. So as that sliver travels, the flash will pop each time to illuminate the entire frame. That's what high speed sync does. You do lose some power, so you can't go full power because obviously it can't recycle that fast. So you might lose 3 or 4 stops of power using high speed sync, but it does allow you to use a higher sync speed than what your camera can actually do. All right. Some people might wonder when that would be important. Well, let's say that you're shooting outside and you want to shoot a shallow depth of field at 2.8. Well, the only way, if you're shooting 2.8 and ISO 100, the only way to darken the exposure is to use your shutter. And you can't go past 200 with a normal sync speed. So by using a flash that has high speed sync, you can move that shutter up to 1/2000th of a second, and then that flash will go pop, 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 pop as that sliver of exposed sensor travels across. All right, let's talk about rear curtain sync. It's used with longer exposures to show movement, okay? A lot of times photographers will use this at night to get light trails. They'll want to use it at receptions to show people dancing. The flash will typically fire as the first curtain fully opens. So in that that video we just watched, as that first curtain comes open and opens, that's when a first curtain sync will fire the flash. But to make movement trail the subject, the flash fires right before the second curtain starts to close. That's what rear curtain sync does. Um, Now you can't use TTL because with TTL there's a pre-flash that fires that shows in the image and causes a ghost exposure. Let's look at an image and I'll show you what I mean. Okay, this is front curtain sync, first curtain sync. All right. If you look here, the Scotch tape is traveling from left to right. You can see the arrow showing the motion. The ghosting, the movement that you see there, is from the ambient light, okay? That ambient light is giving enough of an exposure to show it, okay? So we take a picture. As soon as the curtain opens, that flash goes off, and it freezes the Scotch tape at the beginning of the motion. Then, as the shutter remains open, okay, because we're using a slow shutter speed, maybe 1/20th of a second in this instance, you'll see the ambient light continue to make an exposure which shows that motion going the wrong way. In order to combat that, we use what we call second curtain sync. This is what it looks like with rear curtain sync. So in this instance, we hit the shutter opens, and you'll see to the left of the image, the ambient light is exposing the motion. Then right before the 20th of a second is over and that second curtain starts to close, the flash will fire, freezing the Scotch tape at the end of the motion, at the end of the shutter exposure. That then means that the ambient light exposes the movement, and at the very end of the exposure, the flash will fire and freeze the motion. So that's the difference between first curtain using a slow sync speed, a slow shutter speed, and second curtain using a slow sync speed. This is what we refer to as dragging the shutter, okay? When you hear someone say dragging the shutter, this is kind of what they're talking about. Using flash to freeze the motion, but using a slower shutter speed to let ambient also into the exposure. Autofocus assist beam. Most flash units and some triggers even have a light that's emitted from the flash to help your camera's autofocus in low light. Some flashes have an auto assist beam that's very visible. The Yangyos have a very visible autofocus beam. You can actually see it through your camera. And then some of them have a less visible or even somewhat not visible. But some different systems use different type of light. It can typically be disabled in the camera menu or on the flash menu. You could go into custom functions and turn off the autofocus assist beam if you don't want it. But most people in low light, they do want that because it does help you focus really, really fast. It's typically only useful if you have that flash or the autofocus assist beam on your camera. For example, if you're using a flash, 90 degrees off to the right, the assist beam that it's sending isn't in your viewfinder anyway. It's hitting the side of the person while you're trying to focus on the front of the person. Some triggers, like the Yangyo 622s that I use, do offer an auto assist beam for on-camera controllers. The actual master controller that I use on my trigger actually does emit an autofocus assist beam, which is very, very nice because now I have an autofocus assist on my camera body that's typically not there because the Canon 5D Mark III doesn't have one built-in camera. Some of the newer bodies are actually building them in camera. So even when I take my flash off of my camera, I'm still able to use that. A feature that a lot of people don't really understand or know much about is the modeling light on Speedlights. You can actually get a modeling light. It's a continuous stroboscopic series of flashes that gives you a preview of the light coverage from the Speedlight. If you set that up in your camera, typically it'll use the depth of field preview button to actuate. So you'll hold your depth of field preview button down, and then that will make the camera go pop, 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 pop for about a second typically, and you'll be able to see exactly where that light's going to fall on your subject. Now this can overheat the flash head if you use it too often, so don't really. Honestly, I never use it, but when you're first beginning using off-camera flash and you want to kind of get that effect, you can do that. Not all models have this function, so you might buy a less expensive model that don't have this function. Okay, the custom function menu. Lots of important special features and functions are controlled inside the custom function menu of your Speedlight. You're going to want to consult the manual to determine what those settings are. They're not really easy to see. In fact, on most, if you're on the back of a Speedlight and you're going through the custom functions, it'll just say CF1 on or off, CF2 on or off, CF3 how many seconds, CF4. So it's not really telling you exactly what that custom function is. So you'll generally want to be using those and figuring those things out while you're sitting in front of your manual or while you've Googled the manual and you're looking at the PDF on your computer, because otherwise it's very difficult to understand. Some camera models actually spell out the custom functions when the camera is connected to a comparable flash. So like a Canon 580, when you put that onto a Canon 5D3 camera, you can actually set the custom functions of your flash through your LED screen on your camera, and it does give you more features and tells you exactly what they are. So if you're out in the field and you forget to turn off something that you need turned on in the custom functions and you can't get to the manual, you might want to try putting that on your camera and seeing if that will give you the explanations you're looking for. Some common functions that you want to be able to control in the custom function menu are things like don't go to sleep. If you've got speed lights in the corners of the rooms like Moshi will teach, he doesn't want those going to sleep, so he's going to turn off the sleep function. The modeling light, you might want that on. The multi-flash pulses, some people like to take multiple flash exposures in one single exposure, and you can set the amount of times that flash is going to pulse in that custom function. So when we trigger an off-camera flash, there's a few different ways to do it. The kind of traditional way is a master-slave method. Using that, you'll have one flash on your camera. That flash will then control all the other flashes off camera. This is typically done early technology using infrared, and it required line of sight. So you might have a camera on a flash on your camera that when you press your shutter, it sends a series of infrared beams to all the other flashes saying, hey, here's what's happening, and then do this, and then it would cause the other flashes to fire. This required line of sight, and what that means is that the one flash will have a little red panel on the front of that flash, that's the infrared area, and both of those flashes would have to be facing each other for them to be able to read those communication signals. Newer technology uses radio controls with no line of sight needed. So the 600 series of flashes from Canon, they still can use master-slave method, but instead of having to have line of sight, they use radio triggers to control each other without having to have line of sight. The on-camera flash head can be disabled. In fact, some people would call it, wasting a flash. You'd put that on your camera, and instead of using it to actually fire a flash, you don't want any light coming out of that. You just want to use that to control the other flashes. Nowadays, most manufacturers who have that functionality also produce controllers which you can put on camera, which have a very easy to use menu system to then control all the other off-camera flashes. Now, some cameras actually have menus inside their LED screens that you can use that add functionality, they add control to the flashes that are off camera. And then some speedlights actually have an optical slave option. The ones that I use still have an optical slave, which is kind of nice because when I'm using a strobe light, I can set my speedlights to optical slave mode, and when they see the pulse of light emitted from my Einstein or even another speedlight, they will then see that burst of light and fire. And so I can use those speedlights in conjunction with my studio strobes to give me more flexibility. The one thing to note about that though is honestly, sometimes it's a pain if you have other photographers in the area, mom with a camera and a flash going off. It will trigger every optical slave that you have going off. So triggers and receivers. This is what most people are using these days to work with off-camera flash. A trigger on camera relays a signal to the receivers that are off camera. Okay, so I'll have a trigger on top of my Canon 5D3 or my Nikon D800 or whatever flash I'm using, whatever camera I'm using. Once I release, trigger the shutter to release, it will emit a radio trigger to my speed lights, which are sitting on top of transceivers using either Hot Shoe or PC Sync. Now, depending on the trigger and receiver combination that you buy, they may or may not allow for TTL depending on the equipment. Now, TTL is through the lens. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But you're going to want to decide right up front, do I want a system that allows me to use TTL, or do I want an all manual system? Every TTL system will also go for manual. It also affords you manual functionality, but not every manual system will afford you TTL functionality. Do remember that TTL is proprietary. So if you're using a Canon camera, you need Canon TTL technology in your triggers and the flash units that you buy. Now, Yangyo does make Canon trigger flashes. They make Nikon. So does Neewer and Godox, and some of the other off brands will make flashes that do TTL, but you have to make sure that you're buying the one that's made for your specific camera manufacturer. If you buy a Nikon flash with a camera that is Canon, it will not do TTL even though it's made to do TTL. It will only speak the Nikon language. It's like the difference between speaking Japanese and English. They have to speak the same language. The two different ways that you can use a trigger is either Hot Shoe, which is a Hot Shoe mount, which is what's on top of your camera. You can buy transceivers or receivers where you slide that speed light into the receiver and it uses the Hot Shoe port, or you can actually plug it into the side. And I think Pocket Wizard uses PC Sync ports. Triggers may offer control options. The system that I use, I have a master controller that I put on my camera. It allows me to control the intensity of the flash, the power of the flash, either in manual mode. It allows me to zoom my flash heads. It allows me to turn on and off certain flashes. It allows me to set flash compensation, which we'll talk about in a minute. So all the different functionalities that I could do if I were standing at the back of the flash unit, I can do from my camera because of the specific trigger unit that I bought. Some units provide that, some don't, so you want to kind of educate yourself before you start going out and buying things. Transceivers can be both triggers and receivers. Again, the units that I work with are transceivers. So I can have them either on camera, I can have them off camera, because they both transmit and receive the signal. Now, when I'm using a controller, I do not use a transceiver on my camera. However, it is nice to have that ability, because when I'm in a reception, I can take one of those transceivers, put it on top of my camera, then slide a flash on top of that, and then use the in-camera menus to control all the different flashes I have set up around the room, and that one transceiver will send that signal to everywhere else. So that's kind of nice. Flash exposure methods. Again, manual flash mode. This is where people generally tend to start. The power output of the flash is set by the photographer. Okay, there is no camera metering that's done to adjust the power of the flash. You set the power of the flash, you take your pictures, your image, and then you set your camera to expose based upon the power output. You could set your power to 1/4 quarter power, an eighth power, a 16th of a power. Whatever it is what it is. No metering is done by the camera. No adjustments are made to the flash unit by the camera's metering. It's simply manual. Changes to the camera setting don't affect flash output. If you change the ISO on your camera, if you change the aperture on your camera, it simply has no effect on the power output of your flash. So if you're at 1/4 power at ISO 100 and you take an image and it exposed properly, then you change your ISO to ISO 1000 and you take an image again, because the power on that flash is still set at 1/4 power, it is going to incredibly overexpose your image. Okay? So manual flash mode does have some advantages, and it's very consistent when the distance to the subject doesn't change. Okay, so a lot of people use manual flash mode. Some people swear by manual flash mode only. I'm not that person. I think both manual and TTL have their place. But remember that once you set the power on the flash in manual mode, nothing that you can do in the camera will change the output of that flash. eTTL or TTL. Now, you'll see them written both ways, and it's basically evaluative through the lens or just through the lens. Basically, what this means is the camera is going to meter a pre-flash. Okay, when you press your shutter release, before the camera actually opens that shutter, it's going to emit a quick pre-flash. That pre-flash is going to hit your subject. Your camera is going to then read how much light was put out, how under or overexposed your subject is, and then it's going to adjust the power on that flash based upon the way you tell your camera to meter, whether it's single point or evaluative or whatever it might be. Flash exposure is then controlled by the photographer using the compensation only on the flash unit via the flash unit controller. So if you're using TTL, then you set your flash to TTL. All right, you start taking exposures. That pre-flash combined with the metering of your camera is going to set the power output of your flash unit. Now, if you want to, if your camera isn't reading it properly and you want it to say, you know what, that's a little bit brighter than what I need, then you're going to use what we call flash compensation to turn down the power output. So you might say, okay, this is one stop too bright. So let me expose my flash compensation. Let me turn it down to -1 EV. That's then going to tell your flash, give me one stop less power than what you think. Now, changing the settings on your camera do not affect flash exposure, as the camera will adjust the flash power to compensate for changes to camera settings. Unlike manual mode, if I am in TTL and I change my my ISO from 1 to 100 to ISO 1000, then once I then take another exposure, obviously the camera is going to emit the pre-flash. It's going to read that exposure through the lens, and it's going to know, hey, something's different here. Something's changed. We want to turn this image 18% gray. So instead of being at 1/2 power, I need to now be at 1/64 power. Okay? So as you change your controls on your camera, TTL will change the exposure output of that flash. This is most useful when you're working fast or when the subject to flash distance changes rapidly. If you've got a bride walking down the aisle at you and you're in manual flash mode, there's only maybe a foot or two of distance that she's going to be properly exposed. If you're in TTL, that flash exposure is going to change as she gets closer to you. The camera is going to read through the lens how brightly exposed she is and adjust based upon her distance to the flash. So that's very helpful when working at a reception, when working someone walking down the aisle, when the distance between the subject and the flash is changing rapidly. I'm almost always in TTL mode. And then I'm simply using flash compensation to dial up or down based upon the scene that I'm looking at. So it's not as consistent as manual mode when the subjects are standing in the same spot over and over. Your camera may make a slight mistake. It may expose a little bit brighter or a little bit less bright depending on changing conditions. If the sun goes behind the clouds or whatever it might be, that could affect your meter reading. So if you do have a subject that's standing in the same spot, the same 10 feet from the flash over and over, then you may want to switch to manual mode to get very, very consistent results. Now, it's very important to understand metering if you're going to use TTL. for that matter, if you're going to be using AV mode, aperture priority mode on your camera. By understanding how the camera meters, you're going to be able to more accurately predict where your exposure compensation should be. So to use TTL effectively and consistently and quickly, the photographer has to understand in-camera metering. The camera has no idea what it's looking at. It doesn't know if it's looking at a polar bear in a snowstorm or a grizzly bear in a dark cave, okay? The job of the camera and its metering mode is to simply create an exposure that's 18% gray. When you're looking through your lens and you see a beautiful bride in a big white dress standing against a white wall, your camera is going to want to make that exposure 18% gray. Now, you know when you're looking at it that there's a lot of white in this image. My frame is almost all white. And because of that, you need to remember this saying, if it's white, compensate right. So if you're looking through your camera and you see a bunch of white, know that your camera is going to want to turn everything there to 18% gray, which is less than white. So you're going to want to take your flash compensation and maybe bump it up a full stop, maybe a stop and a third, maybe a stop and 2/3, because your camera is going to emit a pre-flash. That flash is going to see so much white, it's going to say, whoa, 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 overexposed, and it's going to then turn down your flash power output so that it's only putting out enough flash to make everything 18% gray. Well, you know by looking at it, it shouldn't be 18% gray. You should have a lot of white there. Okay? Now, on the opposite side, if you're in a dark reception and you're taking a picture of African American skin tones that are darker in color, then your camera is going to try to overexpose that. It's going to try to say, hey, this is a dark reception hall with a bunch of dark skin complexions. I need to turn everything here to 18% gray. So if it's a dark exposure inside that frame that you're looking at, you might want to compensate to the left and underexpose your flash compensation. Turn it down by a stop or a stop and a third or 2/3 of a stop, whatever it might be. So that's what you want to understand, is that your camera doesn't know what it's looking at. It just sees 18% gray. So if you understand that, and using TTL, and for that matter, aperture priority, you now can understand how to predict where that flash compensation needs to be quicker and more responsive, to be more consistent, and to be faster working when working in TTL mode. Okay? So remember, if it's white, compensate right. If it's dark, you're going to compensate to the left and under expose. Dragging the shutter. This is something that we hear said all the time, and dragging the shutter is said, oh, just drag the shutter, drag the shutter. A lot of people don't really understand what that means. ISO and aperture control the flash exposure, not the shutter. The only two things in manual mode and manual flash that are going to control your flash exposure are your ISO and your aperture. The shutter has nothing to do with the flash exposure. The reason is the flash duration is so fast, even at half power, your flash is only on, it comes on and off in 1/2000th of a second. Now, obviously, your shutter is staying open for a 50th of a second. So that flash is going to come and go long before that shutter opens and closes. All right? So that shutter speed has nothing to do with the exposure you're getting from the flash. Only the ISO and the aperture do that, because the ISO and the aperture both of those will affect how sensitive, how much light, how much of that flash reaches the sensor, and how sensitive that sensor is to that light. Okay, so by dragging the shutter, you have to realize that you have two exposures for every image using flash. The first exposure is your shutter exposure. What shutter speed are you at? That is going to affect how much of that ambient light soaks into the to the sensor. So if you want to realizing that you have two exposures, the way that you typically will drag the shutter is you're going to, first of all, not even turn your flash on. You're going to expose for your ambient light. You're going to get whatever ambient exposure you want first, using the ISO and the aperture you think you'd like to have, and the shutter speed you'd like. So let's say that we set our camera at ISO 100, the aperture is at 4.0, and our shutter speed is at 1/60th of a second. And we take an image, and we see that it's too bright. There's too much ambient. We want to darken that background. Okay, so now, I'm sorry, it's not enough. It's too dark. We want to open up the ambient light. So instead of going at 1/60th of a shutter, we're now going to roll our shutter and drag our shutter open to 1/50th of a second. Okay, now that exposure brightens up the ambient. Okay, but there's still not enough light on our subject. They're still too dark. So we're then going to introduce our flash. Okay, and by massaging the power output on that flash, or massaging the distance between the flash and the person, we're then able to back up or bring it closer, and then actually control how much of that flash is in the frame using ISO and aperture. So for every exposure we take using a flash, there's actually two exposures, one for the ambient and one for the flash. So flash can be used to freeze the subject, while the shutter can be left open longer to let ambient light in. If you've got someone dancing in a dark reception, you can be at 1/30th of a second and use that flash to freeze the subject, and then the ambient light will soak in that 30th of a second, but you won't have motion blur because the flash is such a dominant light source. It is going to burn the sharp image of the subject into the frame, and then you're going to allow the rest of the exposure to come in through the ambient shutter speed. Now, the great thing about this is you can also use that creatively. You can be very creative in receptions by freezing the subject with a flash, but then letting the DJ lights and the rest of the ambient light kind of turn your camera and move it around and get really kind of dancing lights in the exposure. And we'll look a little bit at some of those examples. I didn't want this to have a lot of examples because I just want to kind of get the basics out there. And obviously there's going to be a lot of questions that we discuss in our group once this is shown. If the ambient and flash levels are close, the flash will be less effective at freezing the motion. Meaning, if your flash isn't at least 3 to 4 stops brighter than the ambient, then that flash isn't going to be powerful enough to burn in a frozen subject. So if you're finding that your flash isn't actually being effective at freezing the motion, then all you need to do is make sure that you up the flash intensity, and then it'll start to freeze that motion. High-speed sync. High-speed sync is also known as autofocal plane sync by Nikon. Okay, Canon calls it high-speed sync, and Nikon calls it focal plane sync. It's the same thing. It creates multiple bursts of light to cover each sliver of exposed sensor. We talked about that when we were looking at the video. When you go over the sync speed of a camera, the first curtain is open, and the second curtain follows right behind it, exposing only a sliver of that sensor. And high-speed sync allows that flash to go pop, 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 and to fill in each sliver as the shutters pass over it. This allows the photographer to shoot low aperture and to lower ambient light by using shutter speed in excess of sync speed. So if you want to shoot at 2.8 at noonday sun at 2.8, you're going to have to be at 1/4000th of a second. Obviously, that's higher than your sync speed. So you use high-speed sync to do that. You do lose power in high-speed sync mode, so multiple speed lights might be needed. You might have to combine maybe 3 or 4 to overcome that lower power output. High-speed sync can also be used to fill in shadows while at shallow depth of field. You know, if you're just wanting to kind of fill in shadows somewhere, that's a good use for it. It can be used to balance ambient background with the subject. If you're just wanting to make the sky blue instead of bright white, you know, the sky's blown out in all these natural light shots, the sky is bright white. If you want to bring that blue light in, then you're going to want to lower the ambient exposure and use high-speed sync to illuminate the subject to balance those two exposures. It can be used to lower ambient while at shallow depth of field for dramatic, turning the day into dark. You know, if you're using especially a powerful strobe that can do high-speed sync like an Einstein, you can really get a dramatic daylight look and turn day into night. Even with multiple speed lights, you may need to reduce distance to the subject and remove any modifiers, because anytime you put a modifier on a light, you're cutting the power output. A softbox, might cut a stop of light from a flash. So if you're trying to get the maximum output from these smaller speed lights and you're using a high speed sync, you might have to take off those modifiers and use a harder light source. You may need to move those speed lights closer to the subject. Okay, a lot of times when I'm doing high speed sync and I have to get the flash 3 or 4 feet away from the subject, I'll do a backplate shot, meaning I'll take one shot with the high speed sync and then I'll have my assistant pull the flash out using a tripod. I'll take another shot and then I will use Photoshop to blend the flash out of the frame. Okay, so that's a common technique. Flash exposure bracketing, not very commonly used, but it's the same general principle as exposure bracketing. The number and power level of flash brackets is typically set in the custom function menu. So you can say, hey, I'm going to take 3 exposures, and for the first exposure, I want it 1 stop below on TTL. The second exposure, I want it to be the proper TTL exposure, and the third flat exposure, I want to be a stop higher. So you'll take 3 shots in a row, pop, 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 and each one of those, the flash will put out a different output level as set in your custom function menu. It's generally used to get the one good exposure versus the exposure bracketing that's used to blend in post. HDR photographers, they'll take bracketed exposures and they'll blend those in post to get an HDR image. Flash exposure bracketing is generally not used that way. It's generally used to kind of get the good exposure. And now that more and more people are using TTL, you're seeing less and less of flash exposure bracketing. But I want everyone to kind of understand all the basics, so I'm including this. Multi or stroboscopic. This is a custom function to set the number of flash firings during the exposure. So you'll go into your exposure and you'll say, okay, I'm going to have a 2-second shutter open, 2 seconds shutter speed. During that one shutter open, that one exposure, I want my flash to go off 5 times. Okay, that would be stroboscopic. So you will set it to say 2 seconds and 5 flash. You'll set the shutter to remain open for the length of the flash, and then it'll multi-fire, and then you'll either move the subject or the camera to get multiple exposures in a single frame. Here's a good example. In this example, the camera is sitting in one spot. It's a, let's say, 2-second exposure, and as the subject moves across the frame, the flash will go pop, 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 and then it will kind of expose and give you multiple exposure in a single frame. So that's done using your multifunction, which is known as stroboscopic. Flash ratios. The flash ratio is just a comparison of levels of light from highlights to shadows. Okay, you'll see it something like 1:1. 1:1 is a rare image where the shadows and the highlights are the same light value. So there is no shadow and highlight. It's just lit. It's exposed. Okay, this is not really something that people look to do. It is a very basic look, and it doesn't give much depth. It doesn't give much texture to an image. 3:1 is the ratio when you have 2 times the value of the highlight as the shadow. So the highlights are twice as bright as the shadows. That would be a 3:1 ratio. And a 5:1 ratio would be when you have 4 times the value of the highlight to a shadow. 5:1 ratio is 4:1 to 5:1 is when it really starts to look dramatic. A 3:1 is 2 to 3:1, somewhere in that range of a ratio. It's just a nice exposure ratio. It's kind of a common look. And as you start to move higher up in the 4 to 5:1 ratios, you start to see a more dramatic image. The higher the number, the more dramatic. So let's talk about some different light placements, okay? And I'm doing this not to show you how you should set up your lights. I'm doing this to show you the terminology so that everyone understands what someone is talking about when they talk about key light, okay? So key light or main light, those are usually the same terms. You could use either one. And as you can see here, that's the main light. It's normally the most important light of your setup. It's the light that you're going to be using to expose the subject matter. It could be the sun, it could be a flash, it could be a strobe, it could be a flashlight. Whatever we're using to really expose our subject is really what our key light is. Backlight. Backlight, a rim light, separation light, all these terms are used kind of, you know, you can substitute them as you like. The backlight is really used to show separation from the background. So you've got it behind the subject in this diagram, and you can see that it's coming from behind. It's going to create a rim of light around the subject to separate him from that background. You can use it creatively. You can gel them. You can make them different colors. Generally, you're going to find most people are going to make the backlight the same exposure level on the subject as the key light, or up to maybe a couple exposures above if you want a more dramatic rim light. If you really, really want to kind of blow out the rim light, you can go as high as 4 to 5 exposure levels above the key light. Fill flash. When you hear someone talking about fill flash, they're generally talking about a flash that's used simply to fill in shadows, okay? It's not the main exposure flash. It's not their key light. It's simply used to fill it in. I use fill flash all the time as a wedding photographer. We're outside quite a bit, and as you can see in this diagram, the sun I usually will put behind my subject, which means I've got the sun as the backlight or the rim light. And then I'm going to use a strobe in some way to fill in that the shadows caused by the sun being behind them. It's used by me and many other photographers, especially wedding photographers, outdoor, on location photographers, to fill in dark eyes on sunlit days. Okay. For something like this, you're generally going to have the flash set around the same exposure as your backlight, as your key light, maybe a third of a stop below, somewhere in that range, maybe a third of a stop over. A lot of times, you're also going to make sure that you use a gel on that fill light to make sure it's the same color temperature as your key light, so that you're not creating mixed light conditions. And we'll talk about gelling flashes in later later tutorials. Everyone always hears the term kicker lights, and what's a kicker light? What's a kicker light? It's just an accent light, you know. A kicker light the term started years ago when they used to be just set on the floor, and you're using it to accent something. Okay, typically modified to control spill and target a specific spot. You might use barn doors, you might use grids of some sort, you might use a snoot, but kicker lights are just to add a dash of light somewhere, a splash of light to kind of give attract attention, to create separation. So if someone says a kicker light, that's what they're talking about. And again, these are the terms as I understand them, as most people that I work with use them. There could be other terminologies and other uses for these terms. Hair light. Hair light is specifically what it sounds like. It's used to accent hair and create additional separation. No real difference in hair light and rim light or kicker light is the fact that it's on the hair. Typically, it's snooted or gridded, and typically it's up above the hair, kind of pointing down. Background light. So it's used to illuminate all of or a portion of the background. You can see background lighting diagrams. You can see grids used. You can see snoots used to really control a specific spot. A lot of times you'll see gels used to kind of create on a white background. Maybe they'll put a blue gel over a background light, and it creates maybe a 3 or 4 foot circle of blue light behind the subject, and creates a really nice looking effect. That's just a background light. Some people use background lights, more than one even, to blow out a white background to make it a very high key portrait. High key meaning all bright areas, no real dark shadow. Sometimes gels are used for the color effect. And then ambient flashes, you know, sometimes, and Moshe is going to talk about this. A lot of you I know are going to take his class at Shutterfest. Moshe uses flashes in receptions and venues to really just raise the ambient level. It's a great way. Generally, they're used to simply raise the overall level of light in the environment. They typically aren't really directional. They can even be bounced off walls or ceilings. A lot of people will. Me at my receptions, I'll take lights and point them from the edges of the rooms in towards the center of the dance floors. So I get a nice rim light when I want, but I can also use those as ambient. Okay, so let's talk about the types of modifiers. Hard versus soft light. You always hear people talk about, ooh, a nice soft light or a dramatic hard light. Um, Hard and soft light is a direct result of the size of the light source. Okay, so the larger the light source in relation to the subject, the softer the light. So if I've got a 2 foot square, 2 foot by 2 foot softbox, and it is 100 feet away from this baseball, you're going to get this hard light source that you see in the top. If I take that same 2 foot by 2 foot softbox and I bring it closer, 2 feet away from the light, it is going to wrap around that ball, that baseball now, and you're going to get a much softer light because in relationship to the subject, that light modifier, that 2 by 2 foot is now much bigger. Okay? So there's two ways to soften a light. You can either increase the size of the modifier and make it larger. So I could leave that light 100 feet away and put a 100 foot by 100 foot diffusion panel in front of it, and now it's going to be softer. Okay? Or I could take that light and bring it closer, and simply by bringing it closer, the relationship, the distance between the two has changed, and now that 2 foot by 2 foot softbox is much larger in relationship to the size of the ball, and it creates a softer light. So those are the two ways to change the quality of light. Either make it bigger or bring it closer and keep it the same size. Now, do remember, as you bring it closer, you're also affecting the light fall off, the depth of light. You're also affecting the intensity of that light. So you will have to get a different exposure if you bring that light closer, and you are going to get faster light fall off if you bring it closer. So size is relative to subject. Modifiers do cut light power. If you're putting something in front of a light source, you are going to cut the output of that light. If you put a speed light in a softbox, you're guaranteed to get at least a stop of less of light. So understand that. They can also change the quality and the color of the light. If you've got a silver beauty dish or a white beauty dish or a gold beauty dish, just the fact that the color inside there is going to change the color of the light coming out. So types of modifiers. Bare bulbs, no modifier at all. You can simply take a flash and point it right at someone. Now, because this is a 1 inch by 2.5 inch opening at the speed light, it's going to be a very small light source. A very small light source is going to give you a very hard light. Now, this is good for drama. Sports figures like it. Ladies tend not to. Ladies tend to prefer softer light. So it's creatively whatever you want to do. Okay, you're in charge here. The 8-inch reflector. This is a modifier that's typical and standard. A lot of studio strobes are sold with 8-inch reflectors as part of the kit, and this is what it looks like on a monoblock studio strobe. And it's basically just used to kind of direct the light source into an umbrella. You can do it into a softbox if you want. It's basically used just to get all that light from the bulb kind of heading in the same direction, and then you'll typically modify it with something else. However, you can use grids inside that 8-inch reflector to really focus that light into one little spot. Let's talk about the Speedlight's diffusion panel. We talked a little bit earlier about how you can pull that clear textured diffusion panel out from your Speedlight, slap it down over your panel, and go from the widest 24 millimeters into about 14 millimeters. This will cut about 1.5 stops of light from your Speedlight, but that diffusion panel will give you a wider throw of light. It's not really a softer light per se because the light source is still that same size, but it will give you a softer, a larger area that it'll go out over. Bounce flash. Bounce flash has been a common technique used by photographers with on-camera speed lights for years. You can take the speed light, bounce it up off the ceiling. You can bounce it off the walls. You can bounce it behind you. Really, you can bounce it off somebody wearing a white shirt standing next to you. You can bounce it off of a card attached to your camera. You can bounce it off of a reflector on a stand. Anything you want to bounce the light off of can be used to bounce light. Okay, and if you're moving fast and you're working at a reception, a lot of photographers like this method. They like bounce flash. The drawback of bounce flash is, let's say you've got 30-foot high ceilings. By the time the light travels from your speed light 30 feet up and then 30 feet down, you are really, really working that speed light hard to get output. It's going to mean you have more time between flashes. It's going to mean that the batteries are going to wear out quicker because it's having to push so much more light because it has to travel further. Let's say you're working in a reception area and they have black ceilings or a wooden barn with dark wood ceilings, or you're working outside with no ceilings, or you're working inside of a room with red walls. All these things are going to create a color cast. They're going to soak up light. It's not going to reflect as much light. All these things have an effect on the color of the light and the quality of the light and the amount of light. So keep that in mind when you're considering whether you want to use bounce flash. Is the environment you're in conducive to doing so in a really, really effective manner? A bounce card. Every speedlight has one. That's a small bounce card. Because it's such a common usage, you see other people coming out with bounce cards. On the left, that is gosh, I can't remember what they're called. I own them. On the right is the Dimby bounce card. And both of these are just larger sources of light. And the larger the source, the softer the light. So anything you do to make that a larger, bright white subject, then bright white material, you're going to disperse light from a larger light source. It's going to make it softer. Dome diffusers. This was the first dome diffuser that came out. These have been popular. You'll still see photographers today using them. It basically just takes the light and you push it straight up, and it pushes some out from the front, some from the side, some from the back, some from the top. And this basically bounces light all around the room and kind of creates a nice ambient look. The seemingly preferred dome diffuser these days is the Gary Fong Light Sphere. I use this. A lot of professionals will poo-poo it, and I kind of giggle a little bit. It's great at what it's good at. It's not so good at what it's not good for. So as long as you're using the tools for the right job, you're going to find that they are effective. The nice thing about this for me is it spreads some light forward. It spreads some light up, to the left, to the right. It has a curvature on it, and it bounces light in a different ratio, and I like that. So practice with them. See which one you prefer. Let's talk about softboxes. This first softbox that I'm showing you here is just a Speedlight softbox. You don't see as many of these today. This was kind of the first iteration when Speedlight photographers started going off camera. These came out, and you still see these today. They're out there. I think most of what you're going to see is something like this. This is a collapsible softbox, 2x2 softbox. I don't know if this is the Westcott or the Infusionsoft, or a number of different manufacturers will make these. You'll notice with this, there is a speedlight sitting outside of the softbox and pointing in through a hole in the back. That's a bracket. So that mounting bracket typically is sold separately. And make sure if you are going to use this type of speedlight for your softbox for your speedlight, that you do make sure you get the right bracket. Okay. Another thing to remember is if you're using a hot shoe mount trigger, that will add a few inches from where the speedlight sits on that bracket. And I bought a Westcott Apollo one time that because of the actual distance and travel, I couldn't actually use it. So do be wary of that when you're going out to purchase. This is the Apollo systems that I use now. These are soft boxes, but they're in octaboxes and squares and rectangles. They're based on umbrellas. And the nice thing about these are you can see how they mount through the same umbrella mounting system. You can use the one umbrella mounting hardware and put a softbox on, put an umbrella on, put whatever you want on using the umbrella. They also collapse like an umbrella, so it does make them nice. And you do have diffusion fabric that you put over these to give them a nice diffused look. If you do want something more specular, more of a kind of a highlighted poppy look to the light, you can leave the diffusion material off. So it gives you added functionality. And then this is a type of softbox that is, again, based on the umbrella design, where you simply put the speed light right up next to the diffusion fabric, shoot in through it, and then back out through it. Now, because your speed light is passing through the diffusion material twice, you are going to lose more power, and your battery's going to work a little bit harder. You can see this speed light is actually sitting on top of the YN622 transceivers that I actually use. So you see how that adds a little bit of height to how it sits? That's what I was talking about. Strip softboxes. Strip softboxes are very popular. They're used as accent light, kicker lights. They're typically not used as main lights because they have a very narrow beam. But that's not to say you can't creatively find out a way to use them as a main light. In this instance, you can see this lighting here. There's a 2x2 softbox up top, used in a kind of a beauty disposition, and then this 2 rim side lights are used to kind of add accents on the shoulders and arms and legs. Strip softbox are commonly gridded. Okay, you can add this grid fabric here to control the spill of the light. So instead of it coming out and going sideways, left and right, it goes straight forward. And they are very effective. They don't look like they'd be very effective, but they are. Beauty dishes. This is a popular modifier for many photographers, and the reason is it has a very particular quality of light. It controls the light very well. You can have silver, you can have, this particular one is white, you can have gold, you can have combinations of. Some people will paint them colors or use gels inside of these to give a different look. But beauty dishes are used a lot in beauty photography because they're generally set right above. And here's Lindsay Adler in her Creative Live. I highly recommend watching Lindsay's stuff. She's a fantastic fashion photographer out of New York. You know, in this instance, this is the traditional placement of a beauty dish above and in front, and you shoot right underneath it. It fills in all the texture of the skin. It doesn't create a lot of ugly shadow on skin texture, so it's great for beauty lighting. Okay. Umbrellas. Umbrellas are exactly what they sound like. They're umbrellas. The 2 types of umbrellas that most of you are going to see are the reflection umbrellas. This is a large Paul C. Buff PLM umbrella where you blast the light into the umbrella and then it shines back past the light onto the subject. These are typically used with the black backing on the back of the umbrella. So you see that black material on the back of the silver that makes sure that none of that light spills through and it all gets reflected back towards the source. And this image shows a Westcott combo umbrella. This umbrella can be used. You can see the black material being peeled away. Okay, so you can either put the black backing on the umbrella, and lots of manufacturers do this, and use it as a reflective umbrella, or you can use it on the far right there. You see it being done as a shoot-through umbrella, where you would put the light into the umbrella and shoot directly through it, where it's the light, then the umbrella, then the subject, instead of the umbrella, the light shooting into the umbrella and then reflecting back past the light once again onto the subject. This shows both. So on the left you have the reflective method where you shoot into the umbrella, it then hits the umbrella, spreads back, and then comes back across the speed light on the subject. And on the far right, it's a shoot through where the subject would be standing to the left of the umbrella and it's speed light, umbrella, and then the subject. Grids. We talked a little bit about grids before. Grids are anything that uses this grid pattern to focus light. It is probably the best way to control light. Most photographers love grids. That was a gridded softbox. This is a gridded beauty dish. Very popular way to use a beauty dish. Snoots. Snoots is another way to focus light. Now, snoots will change the quality of light in the way that it kind of overcomes the inverse square law. You can use a snoot to throw light further than the inverse square law would tell you should be able to, because it focuses that beam. A lot of times snoots are used in conjunctions with grids, and this particular snoot image has a photo of a grid in it. So you just would pop that grid into the edge there, and that would control the spill of light even more. And here it is with a strobe light, and a lot of times people use the word strobe to describe a studio light, a monoblock, or a pack and head system, and they'll use a speed light to talk about something else. It's confusing. Strobe, speed light, flash, they're all the same. All right. This is a speed light with a snoot on it. This is the LumaQuest snoot. It's just it kind of wraps around it and creates a circle. Now I'm showing you a ring flash not because this is a type of modifier. This is actually a flash itself. Okay, a ring flash goes around the lens and it creates almost no shadows and gives you a very interesting catch light in the eye. But the reason I wanted to show this and explain a ring flash is because when someone says ring flash, I want you to understand what they're talking about. But secondly, there are 2 products out that I'm aware of, and maybe even more, where you can turn your speed light into a ring flash. Okay, it's still on camera, so it's not an off camera unit. You would use this on camera to wrap around your light and focus that speed light burst of light into a ring system. And this is what you get. If you look in the eyes there, see those catch lights. You notice how there are very little shadows in this image. Okay, the chin, the face outline has a very, very slight rim shadow. That's all because of that ring flash. So it's a very particular look. Some people love it. Some people don't love it. I think it's interesting, and as long as it's used creatively, then go for it. Then there's the reflectors. Now, this is what you would typically see the natural light photographer is going to use quite a bit, but there's no reason flash photographers should not use this. The reflectors are used to bounce light, whether it's ambient light, but you can also use it to bounce flashlight. A lot of times if you've got one speed light and you want to create a backlight and a front light, you can shoot the speed light over the shoulder of the subject into a reflector, and then a reflector will bounce that light back into the face of the subject. So you can turn one light into 2 using these types of reflectors. You'll notice here that there is multiple things this one reflector can use. This is what's typically known as a 5-in-1, 6-in-1, 7-in-1, depending on how many different options they have. But you've got a silver, you've got a gold, you've got a combination silver gold, you've got a white fabric, then you have a simple diffusion material. That diffusion material can be used to diffuse sunlight, natural light, a hard light source. You can hold that up, have your assistant hold that between a bare bulb flash, and it becomes a softbox very, very quickly. So I use that quite a bit on location when we're working fast. Just hold that diffusion material up in front of a bare flash, and you don't have to take the time to set up a softbox if you just need a real quick image that has soft light. This is the stand. This is if you don't have an assistant that works with you, buy one of these stands. It's very, very inexpensive, 30, 40 bucks, maybe 50 bucks for a really nice one, and it will hold that reflector where you need it to be held. This is the new Omega reflector from Jerry Gionis and Westcott. And this is basically a reflector with Velcro pullouts, so you can shoot through it, and it becomes almost like a ring flash using natural light or flash. And the only reason I included this is because if you look in the very center there on the left, there's an arm with a blue and white shirt. That's my hand holding this for Jerry. So I thought that was, he still owes me money for a signed no model release. Now, while these aren't modifiers, gobos, flags, and cutters are used quite extensively to cut light, to stop light from spilling into places you don't want it to be, okay? This is an image of flags. We will call these flags or whatever. Gobos stands for go between optic, okay? Barn doors are a type of gobo. You simply open them and close them to keep light from spilling where you don't want it to be. And then here is a lighting diagram of probably what most of us use in studio, which is a 4x8 panel, just a regular fiber foam core panel, either painted black or bought in black, one side white. You can use one side to reflect, one side to cut light, and you just kind of set them up so that you block light from spilling in places you don't want. This gives you great control over where that light goes, and is used mostly in studio. You don't find a lot of, if you're out shooting a wedding, you're usually not using gobos, flags, or cutters. You just don't have time to set them up. But you can use an assistant holding a reflector if you want to get a really quick shot. All right, that's basically it, guys. I just wanted to use this time to kind of show you guys all the different terminologies, some of the quick and easy things, to give you the information to now start asking questions about. We'll start doing some other types of education. We'll start posting lighting diagrams. We'll start posting images to talk about these things. But if you guys want to start, once this is shown, we can start posting some questions in our off-camera flash Facebook group, and come join us and talk about it, and we'll see you guys all at Shutterfest. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and apologies for any mistakes that were made and for the informality of this, but I wanted to get it done very, very quickly, and there's a lot of material to cover, so I wanted to kind of go through it very quickly. So thanks a lot, guys, and we'll see you soon.